Sobering numbers for the province's governing United Conservative Party today. A new Angus Reid poll has the UCP in a tie with the opposition NDP. Both parties, according to the poll, have 38% of voters on their side. That's a big drop for the UCP. Premier Jason Kenney came to power last year with 55% of the vote, winning 63 of the province's 87 seats. But with the next election 3 years away, how concerned should Kenney, the premier, and his party be? For more, we have reached Shachi Curl. She's the executive director of the Angus Reid Institute, good friend of the show. She's over in Vancouver. And Dwayne Brad is a political science professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary. Hello to both of you. Good to see you.
Good evening.
Hello. Hey, Dwayne.
Shachi, let me start with you. So lay out for me what the big, I mean, we said in the introduction, kind of the big headline is that tie. I know that it was certainly garnering a lot of attention in Alberta. What's behind that? What other data do you have that you think is important to get across?
They're very chastening, very humbling numbers. Of course, important to put into context, Vashi, that it's coming in the, not even at the midway point of the Kenney government's mandate. So lots of time for these numbers to change and move, but really a snapshot saying that, in the first year and a half of this mandate, Alberta voters are starting to, first of all, sour on what they've been seeing out of this UCP government, but also drift, particularly on the right-hand side of the political spectrum. So what stands out to me is on two fronts. First of all, the NDP holding its vote very solidly, but hasn't really been able to pick up any more votes, but hasn't lost any votes. By contrast, if you look at what's happened with the UCP, remember, this was the melding, the marriage of two parties, Wildrose and the Alberta Conservatives. And what we've seen is that we're starting to note some bleed away from the UCP back to sort of other or more fringe parties, picking up 7 points here, 9 points here, 8 points there. So we're seeing some bleed, for example, to the Alberta Party, which is a more centrist. And then we're starting to see some bleed as well to the Alberta Independence Party, which is a secessionist party. So people are starting to head for the exit flaps under that UCP tent on both sides, both on the left side of that tent and on the right side. And the key, of course, for Jason Kenney is to be able to pull everyone back together. If he looks, for example, to Doug Ford as a model in terms of not only bringing his party fully together, but also bringing people who might not have voted for his party into the fold and saying, hey, look at me, I'm here for all Ontarians. That may be a model that Jason Kenney wants to follow, but then we both know Jason Kenney is a very seasoned, experienced retail politician. These numbers may not be good news for him. They may not be all that surprising to him either, because he's chosen a path that has been a little bit combative lately, whether it's with doctors, on the public education front, or on some other fronts.
Yeah, that's what I want to bring Professor Brad in. Professor Brad, I hope you don't mind if I call you Dwayne. Used to interview you all the time in Alberta.
Yeah, there we go, Vassy.
Tell me a bit about what, from your perspective, is driving the drop in that support.
Well, the drop has been occurring. This didn't just come out of the blue. We have seen and noticed a drop ever since the Kenney government was elected about a year and a half ago. Unlike other premiers and the prime minister, there was no COVID bump for Jason Kenney. At the same time, he warned his caucus right after the election, said, we're going to be doing some really difficult stuff. We are going to make public sector cuts. We are going to challenge the doctors, and it's going to be rocky. And sure enough, that is what is going on. But then you throw in a pandemic in the middle of these fights with doctors and teachers, and you can see some of the problems. This isn't all bad news for Kenney, though, because a 38-38 is not a tie. Given the electoral system that we've got and the rural support that Kenney still has. The second is, while there is some movement to a group of independence parties, and not just one, two, the Alberta Independence Party, the Wildrose Independence Party. The other is the movement to the Alberta Party, and that's been a bit more unusual because the Alberta Party doesn't have a leader. They don't have a seat. So it's almost like we're unhappy with the UCP. We'll never vote NDP. So we're going to park our vote for the moment with this Alberta Party that we don't know much about. We just know it's in between the UCP and the NDP. So there's lots of time, but there are some worrying signs that if this continues for Kenney.
I know you asked Shachi of Albertans in the poll, in the survey that you did, some specific questions around issues like, for example, the handling of the pandemic or healthcare. What kind of stuff did you find out there?
Well, what we find is that, there are significant numbers of Albertans who think that, frankly, the province and this provincial government is doing just fine handling the pandemic. Thank you. They're doing just fine on healthcare, doing just fine on the economy, doing just fine on public education. However, when you look at those numbers relative to what other people in other provinces think about their own provincial governments, you see some big gaps. So Alberta is behind the national average, behind the other big provinces, Ontario, Quebec, BC, in terms of how people in those provinces view their own provincial governments. Now, obviously, what matters is what Albertans think, because it's not British Columbians or Ontarians voting in a provincial election. And again, really underscoring there is no provincial election on the horizon in Alberta anytime soon. But what it shows again is that there are some gaps. There is some potential work for the Kenney government to do, just in terms of, I think, maybe taking the temperature down a little bit. And remember, this is also about setting expectations. And Dwayne will have something to say about this as well. Jason Kenney ran for office basically on an argument rejecting the fact that Rachel Notley had not been able to do very much on the pipeline file, had not been able to get the Alberta economy going. And remember, the economy continues to be the #1 issue for Albertans. And she would make the case in the end, and many political watchers would have made the case that, look, Alberta was dealing with a lot of factors that had nothing to do with government policy. Jason Kenney came out at the time during that campaign and said, doesn't matter. She didn't get it done. I'm going to get it done. Here we are about a year and a half in, and the Alberta economy continues to be sort of stalled in second gear,
Well,
can't get
worse,
out of it, can't start revving its engines. And you've got a lot of families, particularly if you look at that demographic between the ages of 35 to 54, families paying mortgages, worried about their jobs, can't move because the value of their homes haven't picked up and really have nowhere to go and are quite concerned. And if you look at economic optimism, Albertans are in fact the most pessimistic in the country in terms of they're most likely to say that things for them are not only worse now than they were a year ago, but are more likely to be worse a year from now than they are today. So that is the mindset that Albertans are dealing with, and this government has to respond to.
You've got to wonder as well, Dwayne, at the outset of Kenney's mandate and during the campaign, very much a lot of that was not only put at the feet of Rachel Notley, but at the feet of the federal government. And it seems like it's a bit harder to make that argument after you've been in office for a while and after you've had to show very high levels of cooperation with the feds, with the Trudeau government throughout the pandemic.
Yeah, and a good illustration of this is the deficit. For years, the UCP railed against the high deficits of the Notley government. In their last year of office, they ran over an $8 billion deficit. We're sitting at a $24 billion deficit now. And you can say, well, it's not our fault. It is because of the pandemic. Then you would also have to say that the drop in oil prices that started in the summer of 2014 wasn't the fault of the previous government as well. So you've got that issue. But there is going to be a fiscal reckoning. And here's where Kenney can get into some real difficulty. How do you start to reduce that $24 billion deficit? Well, if you double down and continue to go after public sector workers, doctors, nurses, teachers, you're going to bleed some support into the Alberta Party, into the NDP. If, on the other hand, you take the leap of faith and introduce a sales tax, you are going to lose supporters to these more fringe right-wing groups that are emerging on Kenney's side, which I think he's much more afraid of losing support there. You also have the challenge of Western alienation, Alberta separatism, which seemed to die down a bit during the pandemic, but is starting to raise its ugly head again. Right now, a lot of money is being pumped into the province by the federal government. How do you continue to fight the federal government and blame them for the economy? These are some tough choices that Kenney has to make. So when you look at the situation now, 6 months from now, a year from now, when they have to start making these tough calls, could be even worse for him.
Okay, I've got to leave it there. I'm out of time. I could talk forever about this. Thanks to both of you for spending some of your time with us this evening. Appreciate it very much. Shachi Kurl, she's the executive director of the Angus Reid Institute, and Dwayne Brad is a political science professor at Mount Royal University.